Introduction. NED, the U.S. government's white gloves. 2. Instigating color revolutions to subvert state power in other countries. Colluding with all sorts of elements to meddle in other countries' internal affairs. Inciting division and confrontation to undermine the stability of other countries. Fabricating false information to mislead public opinion. Using academic activities as a cloak for interference and infiltration. NED exposed and criticized by the U.S. and the international community. Conclusion. Introduction. The National Endowment for Democracy acts as the U.S. government's white gloves. It has long engaged in subverting state power in other countries, meddling in other countries' internal affairs, inciting division and confrontation, misleading public opinion, and conducting ideological infiltration, all under the pretext of promoting democracy. Its innumerable evil deeds have caused grave harm and drawn strong condemnation from the international community. In recent years, NED has kept changing tactics and gone even further in acting against the historical trend of peace, development, and win-win cooperation. It has become more notorious for its infiltration, subversion, and sabotage attempts against other countries. It is imperative to unmask NED and alert all countries to the need to see through its true colors, guard against and fight back its disruption and sabotage attempts, safeguard their national sovereignty, security, and development interests, and uphold world peace and development and international fairness and justice. NED, the U.S. government's white gloves. NED claims to be an NGO that provides support for democracy abroad. In fact, it acts as the U.S. government's white gloves in carrying out subversion, infiltration, and sabotage across the world. 1. NED is the implementer of CIA-covered operations. In the early days of the Cold War, CIA supported opposition activities in socialist countries in Eastern Europe via private voluntary organizations to advance peaceful evolution. After such activities were exposed in the mid to late 1960s, the U.S. government began contemplating cooperation with civil society organizations to conduct similar activities. Hence the idea of setting up an organization of this kind. As William Bloom, an American scholar, wrote, the idea was that the NED would do somewhat overtly what the CIA had been doing covertly for decades, and thus, hopefully, eliminate the stigma associated with CIA-covered activities. 2. NED was established under the auspices of the U.S. government. In 1981, after he came into office, President Ronald Reagan intended to promote his Project Democracy Abroad, and proposed a government-funded and privately run foundation to openly support democratic movements abroad. One of the purposes of NED, created in 1983, is to encourage the establishment and growth of democratic development in a manner consistent both with the broad concerns of U.S. national interests and with the specific requirements of the democratic groups in other countries which are aided by programs funded by NED. 3. NED is funded by U.S. government. On November 22, 1983, the U.S. Congress passed the NED Act, which reiterated the purposes of NED and clarified such issues as congressional appropriations, financial audit by the government, and the requirement to report to the Congress and the President. In 1983, the year when NED was established, the Congress provided $18 million to NED. Over the past 40-plus years, the volume of congressional appropriations has kept increasing in general. According to data from usaspending.gov, NED received an appropriation of $315 million in FY 2023. As a report of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace revealed, almost all the NED's funds come from the U.S. Congress. 2. 4 NED programs are run under the guidance of the U.S. State Department and embassies abroad. As required by the enabling legislation for NED, NED should consult with the State Department on its program plans to seek foreign policy guidance. According to a USAID report, democracy promotion programs funded by the U.S. government, NED consults on an ongoing basis with the State Department, through the Bureau of Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor, with USIA and with U.S. embassies abroad on programmatic matters. 5. NED reports to the U.S. government on its work and accepts audit and oversight by the government. According to the NED Act, NED shall submit to the President an annual report for the preceding fiscal year no later than December 31st of each year. The report should include NED's operations, activities, and accomplishments. Audit of NED is conducted annually by the U.S. Government General Accounting Office. A report of each audit shall be made to the Congress, and a copy of each report shall be furnished to the President. 6. The U.S. government has access to information on all NED-funded programs. According to the NED Act, NED, or any of its duly authorized representatives shall have access to any books, documents, papers, and records of the recipient pertinent to assistance provided through NED. The U.S. Comptroller General or any of his duly authorized representatives shall also have access thereto. 7. NED's mandate is endorsed by the U.S. government. Philip Agee, a former CIA officer, said on a 1995 TV show, "Nowadays, instead of having just the CIA going around behind the scenes and trying to manipulate the process secretly by inserting money here and instructions there and so forth, they have now a sidekick, which is this National Endowment for Democracy, NED." In a report entitled The National Endowment for Democracy, A Prudent Investment in the Future, Kim Holmes, former Assistant Secretary of State, argues that funding the NED is a prudent investment because it is far less expensive to aid friendly Democrats than it is to defend against hostile dictatorships. 2. Instigating color revolutions to subvert state power in other countries. 1. Attempting to overthrow the Iranian government. In September 2022, protests against hijab rules broke out in Iran. Masoud Alinejad, a reporter for the Voice of America Persian Service, released batches of unverified information and pictures to incite public sentiments. According to Al Mayadeen, a Lebanese news channel, between 2015 and 2022, Masoud Alinejad received $628,000 in funding from NED and some other American institutions. Iran Daily cited a document from Iran's Revolutionary Guards as saying that NED used its ties with Masoud Alinejad to interfere in Iran's internal affairs during the hijab protests. In the meantime, NED also supported the Center for Human Rights in Iran and the human rights activists news agency in their fabrication of fake news, and supported dissidents in working with anti-government organizations and media outlets to stage smear campaigns. NED regularly published commentaries on its Journal of Democracy to call for a regime change in Iran through human rights movement. NED is dubbed by Iranian media as a national enemy for democracy and the NED Trojan, disrupting order and inciting unrest in Iran. 2. Using various tactics to infiltrate Arab countries. Since the start of the Arab Spring, NED has made extensive use of social media platforms and funded NGOs for releasing multimedia content and providing online training, in a bid to instigate color revolutions. NED has also run a talent reserve program for democratic transition in the region, funded NGOs to help supporters of democracy, human rights activists and dissidents in exile, encouraged local trade unions to strengthen capacity building, and supported scholars and activists in plotting constitutional reforms in various countries. 3. Playing a part in Ukraine's color revolution. During the 2004 Orange Revolution, NED provided $65 million to the Ukrainian opposition. Between 2007 and 2015, NED allocated more than $30 million to support Ukrainian NGOs and promote civic participation. During the 2013 to 2014 Euromaidan, NED financed the Mass Media Institute to spread inflammatory information. NED also spent tens of millions of dollars in the use of such social media platforms as Facebook, X, and Instagram to spread disinformation, heighten ethnic tensions in Ukraine, and stir up ethnic antagonism in eastern Ukraine. 4. Attempting to overthrow the DPRK government. In July 2002, NED President Karl Gershman told the media that NED was working with the Congress to carry out activities through a number of NGOs and sway public opinion regarding the DPRK, with a view to undermining the DPRK system. In July 2021, Gershman told the media that thanks to NED-funded human rights programs, the totalitarian system is beginning to erode, and eventually this will bring about the system's unraveling. colluding with all sorts of elements to meddle in other countries' internal affairs. 1. Cultivating pro-US forces in target countries. According to its 2021 annual report, NED supported pro-US media outlets, cultivated democracy activists, and financed groups for democracy and freedom in Arab countries. In May 2021, NED President Karl Gershman said that despite being prohibited from Russia, NED funded the operation of a large number of organizations in Russia and supported Russian opposition figures in exile in their struggle against the Russian government at important political junctures, such as the State Duma, presidential and local elections. NED has long been infiltrating Europe and co-opting EU officials. It has been encouraging voice for transatlanticism within EU institutions while suppressing voice for strategic autonomy, and financing independent media in Europe to tilt public opinion in favor of the US. Taking Mexico as a major target country for infiltration, NED has supported organizations like the Mexicans Against Corruption and Impunity and the Mexican Institute for Competitiveness, and obstructed the electricity reform in Mexico. In 2021, the Mexican government sent a note to the U.S. government condemning NED's funding of anti-government organizations in Mexico as an act of interventionism promoting a coup. Since 2017, NED has funded 54 anti-Cuba organizations. In 2018, the Cuban Democratic Directorate, an anti-government organization, said that it had received democracy funds from the U.S. and paid $48,000 to its employees, agents, and contractors in Cuba. Over the years, NED has been funding scholars and journalists to promote democratization reforms in Iran and carry out cultural infiltration against Iran. 2. Misrepresenting the human rights situation in other countries. The NED-sponsored Journal of Democracy habitually holds developing countries to the standard of American-style democracy and criticizes their presidential elections, economic policies, human rights situations, and democratic transitions. In July 2023, the Journal of Democracy published 5 articles on Indian democracy under the theme of Is India Still a Democracy?, claiming that since Prime Minister Narendra Modi rose to power, his government has engaged in what is, by some accounts, a wholesale dismantling of democratic institutions, norms, and practices. In April 2024, the Journal of Democracy published an article Why This Election is India's Most Important, claiming that democratic governance in India has been steadily eroding since Modi's second term began and that the future of India as a plural, secular democracy could be on the line if Prime Minister Modi and his Bharatiya Janata Party win a third consecutive term. Having classified members of the Gulf Cooperation Council as dictatorships, NED has continued to export its values to those countries through academic, cultural, and media activities. According to the NED website and other sources, NED launched 11 programs in the GCC countries in 2021 with an investment of $1.8 million, to support democracy activists, slam the human rights record of those countries, and stoke social tensions in the name of promoting freedom of the press. 3. Manipulating and interfering in other countries' elections. In April 2022 and December 2023, Serbia held its presidential, National Assembly and local elections. NED interfered in the entire election process, and went all out to root for pro-US opposition candidates in the run-up to the elections. In May 2023, after 2 consecutive shooting incidents in Serbia, NED-sponsored human rights groups and pro-US opposition organizations staged mass demonstrations to demand the resignation of the Serbian government. NED has long been financing the Philippines' Rappler News website. According to a report on the NED website, between 2017 and 2021, Rappler received a total of $786,000 in funding from NED. During the 2022 general election, Rappler lobbied the Philippines Commission on Elections for access to internal information including election trends and campaign spending of candidates, which raised questions from various quarters about the fairness and independence of the election. The authorized access was eventually revoked under intense public pressure. NED has long funded anti-Iran organizations such as the Foundation for Democracy in Iran to sabotage elections. This has been admitted in an article by American social activist Kenneth R. Timmerman, the executive director of FDI. In January 2023, Damon Wilson, president of NED, publicly expressed concerns about democracy and fairness of the Nigerian general election during his interview with a Nigerian TV program, inciting division and confrontation to undermine the stability of other countries. Kenneth Woollock, chairman of the NED board of directors, once told the U.S. Congress NED's long-term efforts to empower the opponents of U.S. enemies and their abilities to change foreign governments. 1. Supporting Taiwan independence separatist forces. In 2022, NED and the Taiwan Democratic Progressive Party authorities co-hosted a global assembly of the World Movement for Democracy and invited European parliamentarians and think tank representatives. They tried to mobilize democratic forces to open up the front line of democratic struggle in the East and hype up the false narrative of Ukraine today, Taiwan tomorrow. In July 2023, NED President Damon Wilson went to Taiwan for the 20th anniversary celebration of the Taiwan Foundation for Democracy, and presented a Democracy Service Medal to Tsai Ing-wen. 2. Colluding with anti-China destabilizing forces in Hong Kong. NED has long been colluding with those who attempt to destabilize Hong Kong by providing funds and public support. In 2020, NED set up several projects under its Hong Kong-related program with a total amount of over $310,000 to fund those attempting to destabilize Hong Kong. In 2023, NED colluded with organizations such as the Hong Kong Watch and Amnesty International, as well as anti-China lawmakers from the US, UK and Germany, and nominated Jimmy Lai Chi-ying, one of the elements bent on destabilizing Hong Kong, for the 2023 Nobel Peace Prize. 3. NED has long supported the anti-China organization World Uyghur Congress, with average annual funding ranging from $5 million to $6 million. In March 2024, NED invited a WUC leader to speak at its event, smearing China's ethnic policies and the development of regions with large ethnic minority populations. NED provided financial support to Hidayat Oguzhan, leader of the East Turkestan Education and Solidarity Association, and instructed Hidayat Oguzhan to ramp up anti-China rallies and sow discord between China and Turkey. NED also funded Rushan Abbas, the head of an East Turkestan organization, so that she could frequently visit Turkey and work with East Turkestan forces to stir up trouble. 4. In March 2023, NED President Damon Wilson led a NED delegation to Dharamsala, India, to meet with Tibet independence leaders and show support for Tibet independence activities. In November 2023, NED gave the Democracy Award for Individual Courage to Jigme Gyatso, a Tibet independence activist. In April 2024, NED invited the Kalen Tripa of the Tibetan government in exile Penpa Tsering to its headquarters. 5. NED funded the establishment of 3 local NGO groupings in Georgia at the beginning of the 21st century to organize demonstrations in capital Tbilisi. In May 2024, NED rallied support for and instigated protests in Georgia against the Foreign Agents Bill. Fabricating false information to mislead public opinion. 1. NED President Damon Wilson, in an interview with Asahi Shimbun, falsely alleged that China used technical means and AI to surveil citizens. On November 30, 2023, NED Vice President Christopher Walker made up lies about CPC monopolizing ideas when testifying before the U.S. House Select Committee on the strategic competition between the United States and the Chinese Communist Party. 2. NED-backed Serbian NGOs coordinated with CNN Serbia branch to fabricate China-related fake news, slandering projects undertaken by the Chinese side and hyping up so-called environmental protection, labor, and corruption issues. 3. NED funded the International Republican Institute to launch the second phase of the Bolstering Europe Against the Subversive Tactics of the CPC project, which fabricates and disseminates the so-called threat of CPC to democratic values and transatlantic solidarity. 4. NED invested $17.41 million to carry out 92 projects on DPRK defectors. It funded rock NGOs to run DPRK-themed radios, producing and broadcasting on a weekly basis stories about DPRK defectors from the perspective of democracy and human rights. It created DPRK-themed online publications to spread negative news about the DPRK, trained defectors to become reporters, and encouraged them to defame the DPRK by writing online posts and attending video interviews. 5. NET formed an information matrix against Iran together with Iran International, the Persian service of VOA and BBC, and other anti-Iran media. Negative information is provided to anti-Iran media by NET and its affiliated agencies to instigate intensive news coverage against Iran. Using academic activities as a cloak for interference and infiltration. 1. NET funded the Governance Center for Public Policies in Iraq, which released the National Index for Democratic Transformation in Iraq report for 6 consecutive years, giving low scores every time to Iraq's democracy, and categorizing Iraq as a partial authoritarian transitional country. People from across the society in Iraq disapprove the report as it did not truthfully reflect Iraq's progress in government administration, social governance, democracy, and legal system. They believe the purpose of keeping the scores low is to provide excuses for continued U.S. interference in Iraq's internal affairs and postponement of its military withdrawal. 2. In March 2024, NED's core grantee institution Center for International Private Enterprise, together with the Philippines Makati Business Club and other associations, jointly published the first State of Sustainability Reporting in the Philippines, unfairly imposing upon the Philippines carbon emission standards and obligations of the U.S. and other industrialized countries in the West to pressure the government of the Philippines to change the country's economic structure. 3. NED provided hundreds of thousands of dollars in funding to the European Values Center for Security Policy, Global Security Center and other think tanks to organize various seminars and activities that incite the EU to follow suit with the US small yard, high fence policy. 4. Since the beginning of the Ukraine crisis, the NET-funded Belgrade Center for Security Policy has supported protests by pro-Western demonstrations and criticized Serbia's foreign policy. 5. From January 2022 to January 2023, NET funded, through Atlas Network, the Turkish digital media platform Doktilo1984.com, and supported activities on this platform that spread discontent and incite ethnic tension, social conflict, and political differences. 6. NET has long funded NGOs in Kosovo to instigate tension between the Serbian government and the Pristina Provisional Self-Governance Institution. In December 2023, the NET-funded think tank's Bunker released a report saying that Kosovo is a relatively successful case of American support for nation-building and promotion of democracy, an attempt to whitewash US true intention to invade and split other countries. 7. NET used social media to wage information warfare against Iran. During the protests against hijab rules, a large number of social media bots with a big following emerged, disguising as personal accounts or independent media to spread anti-Iran information and mislead the public. 8. NET and USAID funded multiple Ukrainian organizations to serve as fact-checkers of Ukraine's social media. But such fact-checking is in fact an information filter created by the US on the Ukrainian internet to deceive the Ukrainian people. NET exposed and criticized by the US and the international community. 1. NET's true nature exposed by Americans. Former federal Congressman Ron Paul once posted that NET wasted a lot of American taxpayers' money to support foreign politicians and parties favored by the U.S., and such actions clearly violate the domestic law of the United States. NET provided soft money to fund foreign elections but portrayed such manipulation of election as promoting democracy. Former federal Congressman Barney Frank called for cutting the funding for NET in the 1980s. He argued that giving money to a French union for political purposes, rather than funding public transportation or research on cancer, is not reasonable. The New York Times published mixed U.S. signals helped tilt Haiti toward chaos in January 29, 2006, which reveals how the U.S. government subverted, through NED, Haiti's democratically elected government. In September 2021, Stephen Kinzer, a former reporter of the New York Times, published articles in the New York Review of Books website unveiling that NED collaborates with CIA and USAID to support insurgent forces in other countries in a bid to overthrow regimes that the US dislikes. According to the articles, early members of the NED board of directors were mostly warmongers, and among the current board members are former federal senators enthusiastic about regime change in Cuba and Nicaragua. The mission of NED is to overthrow unfriendly foreign governments and install regimes more in line with American interests. Two NED's misdeeds exposed and criticized by the international community. On July 29, 2015, the Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs issued a statement officially listing NED as an undesirable organization and banned its activities within Russian territory. The statement said the U.S. Department of State had made a clearly hypocritical statement about being deeply troubled over the fate of Russian civic society. Most of NED's projects aim to destabilize the domestic situation in countries trying to pursue an independent policy in line with its own national interests rather than following Washington's lead. In May 2022, the Russian news agency TASS reported that when interviewed by the magazine National Defense, Russia's Assistant Secretary of the Security Council Nail Mukhaitov commented that NED mainly affects young people, attempting to erode their patriotism and downplay the role of Russia in the modern world order. Using liberating the people as an excuse, the West attempts to install negative views about Russia in its citizens. French journalist Frédéric Charpier published the book CIA in France, 60 Years of Interference in French Affairs in 2008, revealing NED activities in France, and stated that NED relies on disbursement from three agencies: U.S. State Department, USIA, and USAID, and serves the U.S. diplomatic and military policies. In 2010, the French website Voltaire Network published an article by its founder, Thierry Masson, titled NED, The Legal Window of the CIA, exposing NED's direct involvement in French NGOs, its interference in French elections, among other misdeeds. In 2018, the Hungarian media Figyelő blacklisted the Hungarian Helsinki Committee, a civil human rights organization funded by NED, as Soros mercenaries, accusing it of colluding with foreign forces and undermining the stability of Hungary. In April 2023, NED opened funding applications to recruit nonpartisan, independent media seeking to defend human rights and the rule of law, and support freedom of speech. Stephen Kinzer, former reporter of the New York Times, cautioned world governments that NED's sole purpose is training people to destabilize governments that Washington disapproves. The Institute of World Economy and International Relations of Russia pointed out in its article The National Endowment for Democracy at 40, Back to Basics, that NED allows the U.S. government to pursue a simultaneous two-level foreign policy with current dictatorial governments, in which the U.S. government maintains relations, while NED works at the sub-state level over the long term to cultivate required political forces capable of replacing these governments in the future. NED can play a role in sensitive areas where government programs are inconvenient. In June 2023, Agência Brasil quoted Camila Fiavidal, professor at the Federal University of Santa Catarina, as saying that NED is strong evidence of democracy being used as a pretext for seeking gains and a moral excuse for meddling in other countries. In 2016, the Indian government put NED under watch list due to its donation to NGOs in contravention of the provisions of the Foreign Contribution Regulation Act. Conclusion: under the guise of democracy, freedom, and human rights, the United States has used NED for infiltration, interference, and subversion against other countries. This has grossly violated other countries' sovereignty, security, and development interests, blatantly breached international law and basic norms of international relations, and severely jeopardized world peace and stability. Such unpopular and despicable acts are firmly opposed by the international community. The world is moving toward multipolarity, and there need to be greater democracy in international relations. Every country has the right to pursue a development path suited to its national realities and the needs of its people. No country is in a position to lecture others on democracy and human rights, still less using democracy and human rights as excuses to infringe upon the sovereignty of other countries, interfere in their internal affairs and incite ideological confrontation. Following humanity's common values of peace, development, fairness, justice, democracy, and freedom, members of the international community should engage in exchanges and dialogue on the basis of mutual respect and equality, and work together to contribute to the progress of humanity. William Bloom, Trojan Horse, the National Endowment for Democracy. How many Americans could identify the National Endowment for Democracy? An organization which often does exactly the opposite of what its name implies. The NED was set up in the early 1980s under President Reagan in the wake of all the negative revelations about the CIA in the second half of the 1970s. The latter was a remarkable period. Spurred by Watergate, the Church Committee of the Senate, the Pike Committee of the House, and the Rockefeller Commission, created by the President, were all busy investigating the CIA. Seemingly every other day there was a new headline about the discovery of some awful thing, even criminal conduct, the CIA had been mixed up in for years. The agency was getting an exceedingly bad name, and it was causing the powers that be much embarrassment. Something had to be done. What was done was not to stop doing these awful things. Of course not. What was done was to shift many of these awful things to a new organization, with a nice-sounding name, the National Endowment for Democracy. The idea was that the NED would do somewhat overtly what the CIA had been doing covertly for decades, and thus, hopefully, eliminate the stigma associated with CIA-covered activities. It was a masterpiece of politics, of public relations, and of cynicism. Thus it was that in 1983, the National Endowment for Democracy was set up to support democratic institutions throughout the world through private, non-governmental efforts. Notice the non-governmental, part of the image, part of the myth. In actuality, virtually every penny of its funding comes from the federal government, as is clearly indicated in the financial statement in each issue of its annual report. NED likes to refer to itself as an NGO because this helps to maintain a certain credibility abroad that an official U.S. government agency might not have. But NGO is the wrong category. NED is a go. We should not have to do this kind of work covertly, said Carl Gershman in 1986, while he was president of the endowment. It would be terrible for democratic groups around the world to be seen as subsidized by the CIA. We saw that in the 60s, and that's why it has been discontinued. We have not had the capability of doing this, and that's why the endowment was created. And Alan Weinstein, who helped draft the legislation establishing NED, declared in 1991, a lot of what we do today was done covertly 25 years ago by the CIA. In effect, the CIA has been laundering money through NED. The endowment has four principal initial recipients of funds: the International Republican Institute, the National Democratic Institute for International Affairs, an affiliate of the AFL-CIO, and an affiliate of the Chamber of Commerce. These institutions then disperse funds to other institutions in the US and all over the world, which then often disperse funds to yet other organizations. In a multitude of ways, NED meddles in the internal affairs of numerous foreign countries by supplying funds, technical know-how, training, educational materials, computers, faxes, copiers, automobiles, and so on, to selected political groups, civic organizations, labor unions, dissident movements, student groups, book publishers, newspapers, other media, etc. NED typically refers to the media it supports as independent despite the fact that these media are on the U.S. payroll. NED programs generally impart the basic philosophy that working people and other citizens are best served under a system of free enterprise, class cooperation, collective bargaining, minimal government intervention in the economy, and opposition to socialism in any shape or form. A free market economy is equated with democracy, reform, and growth, and the merits of foreign investment in their economy are emphasized. From 1994 to 1996, NED awarded 15 grants, totaling more than $2,500,000, to the American Institute for Free Labor Development, an organization used by the CIA for decades to subvert progressive labor unions. Eifeld's work within Third World unions typically involved a considerable educational effort very similar to the basic NED philosophy described above. The description of one of the 1996 NED grants to Eiffeld includes as one its objectives, build union management cooperation. Like many things that NED says, this sounds innocuous, if not positive, but these in fact are ideological code words meaning keep the labor agitation down, don't rock the status quo boat. The relationship between NED and Eiffeld very well captures the CIA origins of the endowment. NED has funded centrist and rightist labor organizations to help them oppose those unions which were too militantly pro-worker. This has taken place in France, Portugal, and Spain amongst many other places. In France, during the 1983-4 period, NED supported a trade union-like organization for professors and students to counter left-wing organizations of professors. To this end it funded a series of seminars and the publication of posters, books, and pamphlets such as Subversion and the Theology of Revolution and Neutralism or Liberty. NED describes one of its 1997-98 programs thusly, to identify barriers to private sector development at the local and federal levels in the Federal Republic of Yugoslavia and to push for legislative change, to develop strategies for private sector growth. Critics of Yugoslav President Slobodan Milosevic, a socialist, were supported by NED grants for years. In short, NED's programs are in sync with the basic needs and objectives of the New World Order's economic globalization, just as the programs have for years been on the same wavelength as U.S. foreign policy. Interference in elections. NED's Statement of Principles and Objectives, adopted in 1984, asserts that no endowment funds may be used to finance the campaigns of candidates for public office. But the ways to circumvent the spirit of such a prohibition are not difficult to come up with. As with American elections, there's hard money and there's soft money. As described in the Elections and Interventions chapters, NED successfully manipulated elections in Nicaragua in 1990 and Mongolia in 1996, helped to overthrow democratically elected governments in Bulgaria in 1990 and Albania in 1991 and 1992, and worked to defeat the candidate for Prime Minister of Slovakia in 2002 who was out of favor in Washington. And from 1999 to 2004, NED heavily funded members of the opposition to President Hugo Chavez in Venezuela to subvert his rule and to support a referendum to unseat him. Additionally, in the 1990s and afterward, NED supported a coalition of groups in Haiti known as the Democratic Convergence, who were united in their opposition to Jean-Bertrand Aristide and his progressive ideology, while he was in and out of the office of the president. The endowment has made its weight felt in the electoral political process in numerous other countries. NED would have the world believe that it's only teaching the ABCs of democracy and elections to people who don't know them, but in virtually all the countries named above, in whose electoral process NED intervened, there had already been free and fair elections held. The problem, from NED's point of view, is that the elections had been won by political parties not on NED's favorites list. The endowment maintains that it's engaged in opposition building and encouraging pluralism. We support people who otherwise do not have a voice in their political system, said Louisa Cohen, a NED program officer. But NED hasn't provided aid to foster progressive or leftist opposition in Mexico, El Salvador, Guatemala, Nicaragua, or Eastern Europe, or, for that matter, in the United States, even though these groups are hard-pressed for funds and to make themselves heard. Cuban dissident groups and media are heavily supported, however. NED's reports carry on endlessly about democracy, but at best it's a modest measure of mechanical political democracy they have in mind, not economic democracy, nothing that aims to threaten the powers that be or the way things are, unless of course it's in a place like Cuba. The endowment played an important role in the Iran-Contra affair of the 1980s, funding key components of Oliver North's shadowy Project Democracy Network, which privatized U.S. foreign policy, waged war, ran arms and drugs, and engaged in other equally charming activities. At one point in 1987, a White House spokesman stated that those at NED run Project Democracy. This was an exaggeration, it would have been more correct to say that Ned was the public arm of Project Democracy, while North ran the covert end of things. In any event, the statement caused much less of a stir than if, as in an earlier period, it had been revealed that it was the CIA which was behind such an unscrupulous operation. Ned also mounted a multi-level campaign to fight the leftist insurgency in the Philippines in the mid-1980s, funding a host of private organizations, including unions and the media. This was a replica of a typical CIA operation of pre-Ned days. And between 1990 and 1992, the endowment donated $250,000 of taxpayers' money to the Cuban-American National Foundation, the ultra-fanatic anti-Castro Miami group. The CANF, in turn, financed Luis Posada Carriles, one of the most prolific and pitiless terrorists of modern times, who had been involved in the blowing up of a Cuban airplane in 1976, which killed 73 people. In 1997, he was involved in a series of bomb explosions in Havana hotels, and in 2000 imprisoned in Panama when he was part of a group planning to assassinate Fidel Castro with explosives while the Cuban leader was speaking before a large crowd, although eventually, the group was tried on lesser charges. The NED, like the CIA before it, calls what it does supporting democracy. The governments and movements whom the NED targets call it destabilization. February 7, 2025. 40 years bashing the National Endowment for Democracy. James Bovard. Facebook, Twitter, Reddit, Bluesky. Email. On Sunday, Elon Musk posted on X, "Those who know, please reply to this post listing all the evil things that Ned has done." It's a long list. After that merciless arm twisting, I have no choice but to recap my Ned bashes going back to shortly after it was launched in 1983. From the start, that agency looked like the most brazen money laundering operation in recent federal history, siphoning masses of tax dollars from the Treasury and delivering them directly to hacks in the Democratic and Republican parties. The original legislation prohibited such stuff our own pocket with tax dollars orgies, but nobody in Washington chose to enforce the law. Throw in pious hokum about saving democracy around the world and it became a four-star Washington scam. In a November 29, 1985 piece in the Oakland Tribune, I hailed Ned as one of the newest, most prestigious boondoggles on the Potomac. But there were plenty of scoffers early on. Ned has been called many things: an international political action committee, the taxpayer funding of foreign elections program, and a slush fund for political hacks who like to travel to warm climates in cold weather. In less than 2 years, Ned has lived up to all these epithets. My op-ed concluded, "The sooner Ned is abolished, the cleaner our foreign policy will be." Alas, my article did not cause Washington to repent. The following year, after fresh Ned scandals, Sen. Ernest Hollings howled, "This thing is not the National Endowment for Democracy but the National Endowment for Embarrassment." Rep. John Conyers complained, "From its very inception, the National Endowment for Democracy has been riddled with scandal and impropriety." But it was a Jobs for the Boys program that enabled politicians to launder money to plenty of their aides and donors, so it survived one pratfall after another. The original legislation prohibited Ned from interfering in foreign elections, but everybody in Washington quickly forgot about that asterisk. In 2006, in an article headlined "Defining Democracy Down in the American Conservative," I wrote, "In 2001, Ned quadrupled its aid to Venezuelan opponents of elected President Hugo Chavez, and Ned heavily funded some organizations involved in a bloody military coup that temporarily removed Chavez from power in April 2002. After Chavez retook control, Ned and the State Department responded by pouring even more money into groups seeking his ouster. The International Republican Institute, one of the largest Ned grant recipients, played a key role both in the Chavez coup and also in the overthrow of Haiti's elected president, Jean-Bertrand Aristide. In February 2004, an array of Ned-aided groups and individuals helped spur an uprising that left 100 people dead and toppled Aristide. Brian Dean Curran, the U.S. ambassador to Haiti, warned Washington that the International Republican Institute's actions risked us being accused of attempting to destabilize the government. The U.S. pulled out all the stops to help our favored candidate win a free and fair election in 2004 in the Ukraine. In the 2 years prior to the election, the United States spent over $65 million to aid political organizations in Ukraine, paying to bring opposition leader Viktor Yushchenko to meet U.S. leaders and helping to underwrite exit polls indicating he won a disputed runoff election, according to the Associated Press. Congressman Ron Paul complained that much of that money was targeted to assist one particular candidate, and millions of dollars ended up in support of the presidential candidate, Viktor Yushchenko. Yet with boundless hypocrisy, Bush had proclaimed that any election ought to be free from any foreign influence. In a 2009 piece for the Future of Freedom Foundation, I wrote, "NED is based on the notion that its meddling in foreign elections is automatically pro-democracy because the U.S. government is the incarnation of democracy. NED has always operated on the principle that what's good for the U.S. government is good for democracy." In 2017, the Trump administration dropped democracy promotion from the list of official goals of U.S. foreign policy. In a USA Today op-ed with the headline, "End Democracy Promotion Balderdash," I wrote that the reform could sharply reduce America's piety exports. It is time to recognize the carnage the U.S. has sown abroad in the name of democracy. I warned. Democracy promotion gives U.S. policymakers a license to meddle almost anywhere on earth. The National Endowment for Democracy, created in 1983, has been caught interfering in elections in France, Panama, Costa Rica, Ukraine, Venezuela, Nicaragua, Russia, Czechoslovakia, Poland, Haiti, and many other nations. Rather than delivering political salvation, U.S. interventions abroad more often produce no-fault carnage. In a 2018 op-ed headline "Time for the U.S. to End Democracy Promotion Flim-Flams in the Hill," I wrote, "Democracy promotion has long been one of the U.S. government's favorite foreign charades. The Trump administration's proposal to slash funding for democratic evangelism is being denounced as if it were the dawn of a new dark age. But this is a welcome step to draining a noxious swath of the Washington swamp. Unfortunately, many Washingtonians are blinded by self-serving sanctimony." National Democratic Institute President Kenneth Woolek claims that equating U.S. and Russian interventions in foreign elections is like comparing someone who delivers life-saving medicine to someone who brings deadly poison. But the opiate crisis illustrates how easily therapeutic concoctions can produce vast carnage. Democracy often provides a vast improvement in governance in foreign lands, but bribery, finagling, and bombing are poor ways to export freedom. Can Washington politicians and policy wonks explain why the U.S. government deserves veto power over elections everywhere else on earth? Since that 2018 op-ed, NED became a top funder of the censorship industrial complex at home and abroad. It has also continued trying to rig foreign elections. NED tacitly justifies itself because God wants democracy to win. The U.S. government is simply doing God's work, or doing what God would do if he knew as much as U.S. government agencies. But its foreign meddling is routinely shielded from Freedom of Information Act requests. In order to save democracy abroad, the U.S. government blindfolds Americans to NED's conniving and corruption around the globe. In 1984, Congressman Hank Brown deftly summarized why NED had no right to exist. It is a contradiction to try to promote free elections by interfering in them. But contradictions never stop the growth of Leviathan. NED's continued existence is a testament to the perpetual perfidy of U.S. foreign policy. Will Americans soon see the dirt on far more NED scandals?